Okay, here we are. Welcome back, everyone who is with us for the first session of today's virtual annual conference of ICVA. Great to have you back with us. And for those of you who are just joining us mid-conference today for the second session, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're connecting from today. I'm in Herod Lang from PHAP, that's the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. I'm helping out today through the whole day as co-facilitator as PHAP is working with ICVA to ensure that their annual conference can go on despite the travel restrictions and other complications in this challenging time that we're all dealing with around the world. Now, for this second session, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Dr. James Munn. Jamie is the director of the Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC, in Geneva, where he leads the Humanitarian Policy Program, and is the representative to the UN and its member states. Over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Anha. It's very nice to be here with you. I just wanted to get to where we are going next with following on from session one. I think session two is asking us a very big question of what risk are we faced with when it comes to NGOs. So this second session, we're delighted to have two representatives from NGO networks and two operational NGOs with us. This is a follow-on, of course, from the first session, and I thought what we would try to do is focus on some of the risks that NGOs are facing due to the principles being put under pressure. And we'll leave it a bit open right now so that we have our speakers have the opportunity to explore what that really means. But at the same time, we all know that we work often in very volatile conflicts or situations where we might call them extreme complex humanitarian emergencies. And that will inevitably mean that a lot of eyes are on us, donor eyes, community eyes, most importantly, peers and others. So what we want to try to do is explore today in this afternoon session, what kind of pressures do we face? How do we mitigate some of the risks? And then also, how do we look at a better response and responding to these risks in a more proactive and honest way, as the discussion is claimed to be an honest conversation on what risks are putting the principles under pressure. So I started this afternoon by saying we have four speakers. So I will introduce each of the speakers just very quickly now, and then I will start with positing a few broad questions in which we'll turn to the speakers, and I will indicate which one goes to which speaker. So we have Mr. Jeremy Rappel, who is the head of humanitarian financing and coordinator of the Less Paper More Aid at ICVA. We also have, delighted to have, I should say, Hibek Kalfan, who is the executive director of the NIR Network, which is the Network for Empowering Aid Response. And then we have Monsieur Jean-François Riffaut, who's the recently appointed, congratulations, executive director of Action Against Hunger France. And our fourth speaker is Mr. Khalil Desai, who is the head of governance at Islamic Relief Worldwide. So those will be the four people that we'll hear from coming up next. So some of the broad questions, I think. Let's start with Jeremy, if you're ready. I wanted to ask you a very quick overview from your perspective and where you work with the network. What are some of the risks that you think humanitarian NGOs are most engaged with in 2020 and where we should be looking on the horizon, particularly as it means mitigating or managing some of these risks?
Yes, thanks for that, Jamie. And I think, as you stated at the beginning, it's quite an interesting opportunity to discuss a little more depth risk today. And here I'm excited myself to hear from the other speakers and the participants as well. I think on a broad level, your question on what some of the driving factors are, I think we certainly see a few areas that currently stick out in the NGO space in particular with regard to risk. I think we have certainly an area around donor contracts and conditions. So how well we're, or I should say how we're being faced by an increasing donor demand for accountability. I think we hear a lot in current language around the concept of zero risk, or zero tolerance, high levels of potential transfer of risk to partners from donors. and also some issues with transfer of risks all the way through to national partners as well. And this, I think, can largely be related to how we set up donor contracts and conditions in our work. So I think there's certainly a risk area there. More specifically, I think we see an increasing level of risk around staff care and security. I know for local partners in particular, but across the NGO community, there's, as we heard in the start, typically high pressure to work in high-risk environments. That's inherent part of the humanitarian space. But the level of resource that gets put into staff care, security measures can vary quite a bit depending on location, depending on the type of partner or NGO working. So getting that mix right of the pressure to work in high-risk environments, but also the need to ensure that we have appropriate resources for staff care and security, I think certainly a high-risk area. I think another one I would highlight as well in the current landscape would be counter-terror measures. I think this is policy around CTM has certainly been an increasing issue and focus in recent years. So we've seen increasing levels of donor restrictions on partnering, on geographic engagement. And I think this can be a big issue when it comes to potential gap between, particularly gaps when it comes to the staff signing agreements between organizations and some of the donor knowledge of field practice, for example. Not to mention many counterterror measures involve high levels of accountability over long periods of time. So many of the restrictions that are placed on partnerships that deal with counterterror issues frequently can have time horizons of more than 10 years, which go beyond a lot of standard accounting practices or retention of documents, for example. So I think in this area of CTM, we also see a big risk issue. Maybe linked to those issues, I think just important to be cautious though, as you look into key issues like that to drive the discussion around risk management in particular. I think that current issues like that can be good motivators to push for change, but I think also good to remember that risk management should be a foundational part of how we operate, not only driven by current issues. So good to both have the motivation from current issues to drive an interest, but I think also to be cautious that ultimately part of doing good work, part of effectively meeting the needs of people in crisis, of serving people better, is to ensure that we manage risk well and embed that into our organizations. So good to, I think, keep that fundamental need to include it in risk management as part of our work in mind as well. Let me pause it there.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's good. I was wondering, can we turn to HIBEC now? And I wanted to ask you to follow up on what Jeremy had just said, particularly around I was wondering if you could speak to maybe a little bit about the national NGOs and how what are some of the key top risks that you are currently faced with in your membership?
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everybody. My name is Sabak Kalfan. I work with the NIR Network. We're a Global South organization or network of local and national organizations. We're over 208 members around 41 countries. And the conversation of risk actually comes up quite a bit. Since joining the network in 2018, it's one of the top conversations. And in the last 18 months, we've worked with over 100 stakeholders on developing and validating and actually beginning to test a localization performance measurement framework. And risk is embedded in this framework, especially around two areas. And those two areas are partnerships and funding. Among, obviously, within partnerships, we talk a lot about physical and security risk. And to Jeremy's point, there are lack of resourcing around security risk and of course fiduciary and financial risk. From the conversation of the physical or security risk, we continue to hear from our members around the lack of duty of care around partnership, We continuously hear about, security being a system that or a process that isn't focused on when we look at contracts. Typically, a lot of our members deal with direct subcontracting, and that mainly talks around direct project costs, and so they don't receive overheads and indirects to focus on risk mitigation plans and security plans that are above and beyond the actual direct implementation. Around financial risk, we continuously talk around kind of the due diligence process, and local organizations continuously going through due diligence processes, and as their donors mainly being international NGOs, having to comply with different financial systems, and the same idea around local and national actor budgets being for direct implementation and not necessarily to have the space to be able to develop financial systems. And so for us, I mean, those are some of the concerns, but there are great initiatives that exist that we continuously hear about, and we learn from our members as well. Where it comes to security risk, there are some really great strategic partnerships between international organizations, the UN, and some of our members and even donors, where we see the need and the want to be able to help develop an ecosystem where everybody's really thinking about the duty of care of national staff for international organizations, but also national partners. And for financial risk, we continuously see organizations shifting from this mindset of workshops and capacity strengthening workshops to actually institution building. I mean, there's an example of twinning in Afghanistan and in Somalia, where international organizations work directly with local partners to be able to help build these financial systems and operations and HR systems to be able to abide by different compliance regulations. So there are really good examples, but typically we hear about physical and financial risk being the two largest areas of risk that our members deal with.
Thanks for that. I think you've raised a couple of really interesting points, and I was wondering if we could explore a little bit around the duty of care, just to keep you on that focus. I liked very much the example that you just raised on the twinning opportunities that you've heard about in Afghanistan, particularly around the dealing of risk transfer and the budget mainly being focused on implementation at national and local levels, whereas, of course, all national NGOs and local NGOs need just as much strengthening of their systems to meet donor compliances as internationals do. I wonder if you have also heard of anything similar around duty of care and security.
Unfortunately, there hasn't been any direct programs that I've heard of. I mean, I think that we've spoken to different international organization country directors, and they believe that their duty of care goes beyond just their national staff and is extended to their partner. But it's not systematic. It's not something that exists within a particular agency or a particular organization, but it's very much on a case-by-case basis. We obviously believe that that's something that would work towards when you're working towards a strategic partnership, is that you start to think about these areas. I mean, we were told that now actually OFDA as a donor requires that not only its grantee has a security plan, but now there's a requirement of partners also having security plans, and not just a kind of ticking of the box plan, but an actual mitigation plan when it looks towards its international organizations, its direct grantees, and its sub-grantees, which are some of our members.
Thanks for that. I think that's really, I think there's a lot of food for thought in your answer just there, and I'm sure that we'll come back to that. Jean-François, after hearing from Jeremy and Hibek and hearing from them as representatives of a group of different diverse actors in our NGO world, sure, I wonder if you wanted to touch a little bit upon some of the key areas of risk management that action against hunger is faced with at the moment, and what we're trying to do as an agency to address some of the risks.
Yes, thank you, James, and good afternoon all. I'm Jean-François from Action Against Hunger France, and for sure we have a particular look at the question of risk, especially because of the recent events that we had to face and to deal with last year and still ongoing this year in the different context where we are active. And just to set up a little bit the context, we are running operation in 20 different countries, from Afghanistan to Yemen, from Nigeria to Burkina Faso, from Iraq to Liberia. I mean that we are facing a permanent evolutive situation, even though the situation can be different from context to another. But the first idea I would like to put on the table is that the question of risk for us, at least for me, is that it's an evolutive question. It's a broad question and it's an evolutive question. Broad question first because it's number one a question for us. How do we want to deal with risk? Do we want to be a risk-driven or a risk control-driven organization, or do we want to remain a people needs-driven organization that takes care of risk everywhere at every level of the organization? So the first point for me is the question of the posture, and which means that it's also a question of the culture of the organization, especially when we are physically present in various countries where security and safety are at stakes, and where security and safety level of risk is in perpetual change and evolution. On this second idea of the fact that risk is a changing element, an everyday changing element, I would like to share two ideas on that. Because it's changing every day, potentially, we have to remain and we have to maintain the organization agile. We have to maintain the organization well organized, well structured. It means that we have to have policies at every level of the organization. We have to have process, and we have to have also a permanent capacity of assessment on safety and on security. But also because of that, it moves and it can change from one day to another. We have to have very quick and short, very quick capacity of action in order to adapt our response, our duty of care, or our control on the operation, on the evolution of risk. And out of that, I think, as I'm talking about the fact that the question of risk is very evolutive, I would like to link with the main topic of today, I think, and of this morning, as I understood, which hits the question of the principles. All the risks we are facing on the ground are kind of traditional one. It's a question of safety and it's a question of security for our staff, but mainly for the population and for the communities. But there is a very new one, which is way larger than the other one, and way much more scary than the other one. It is the risk that hits the principles, because this one has two consequences. It's a risk in itself to see the power of humanitarian principles being at stakes, is a risk in itself about the fact that we as active humanitarian organization, or we as networks of organization, are who we are at the moment. And so we have to consider that risk on principle is a condition of existing for our organization. But I would like also to share my final comment on that, which is that risk on principles is also a risk on traditional risk, because it makes security and safety more and more fragile. Because when people start not to respect, or when people start to argue about the principle, when we have principle at risk, it means that on the ground, at the very end of the process, we have people who start to be much more exposed to security and safety. So just to conclude, I think that we are not facing different risks than any other humanitarian organization, but we are trying to adapt to the evolution, and also to the link between the fact that principles are at stake and the consequences it has to the level of risk on security and safety we are facing.
Thanks for that, Jean-François. I think that you've really hit a lot of the key issues that we at NRC are also faced with, as are many, many others, including Islamic relief worldwide. So, Khalil, I wonder if I can come to you and just to follow on that final point from Jean-François, that the risk of that we face around just to simply acknowledging that the humanitarian principles are being challenged. They're being challenged by host governments and the responsibilities or restrictions that they're being placed on NGO activities to donors, and the relationships that Jeremy and Hibak started talking about earlier on around financial compliance issues and the way in which that puts the principles at risk. I wonder if you might want to say a few things from Islamic Relief's perspective on counterterrorism legislation and how that impacts as a representative of those very risk-against principles that Jean-François mentioned.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. It's a real privilege to be on this panel and to be talking on this issue. I think fundamentally because of, I think as you've rightly identified, James, I think what our experience is that the management of risk and the way in which certain organizations are treated, there's a very different and sort of disproportionate approach taken because of where we are in terms of how we're dealing with risk management. So I think as humanitarian actors, I think it's all very clear to us that we absolutely, understand and live the very clear risks that exist in operating in some of the most complicated and challenging circumstances and dealing with, countries and situations that are hugely demanding. I think what's changed now, and certainly within the last 10 years, the notion of risk management for an organization and amongst governments, amongst donors, amongst financial institutions has taken such precedence that there are a huge number of judgments and impressions that are being applied to certain types of humanitarian actors. So what we've seen and what we particularly kind of are involved in terms of smaller organizations, localized implementing partners, Hibak and Jeremy have alluded to this as well, that the language and this emphasis around particularly kind of stringent and onerous counterterrorism measures that simply are oblivious to the particular role that humanitarian organizations play, combined with increasingly onerous and, arguably measures that sit in contradiction to humanitarian principles coming out of donors, institutional donors. And then the third limb of that, the fact that financial institutions, banks, are making decisions which are far from transparent about who they bank with or who they provide banking services to. The impact of that is that, and I think it's something for the whole sector to engage with, is that it's excluding and it's isolating certain key players, key humanitarian actors. So what lots of very significant and, kind of erudite research has demonstrated, there's the LSE ODI research of 2018, is that Muslim faith-based organizations, diaspora organizations, and localized smaller organizations are essentially having to meet sort of standards and expectations over and above those that potentially other organizations are having to meet. So in terms of the legitimacy and the role that we want the sector as a whole to play and to represent, this notion of risk is being used to actually isolate and prevent certain parts of our sort of sector to participate in humanitarian action. What we also know is, and we see this, typically we've had to be on the front line of this as an organization with Islam and Islamic in its name. There's very broad generalizations and assumptions being made about what we do and who we are. So it's creating additional burdens, additional risk management standards for certain parts of the sector compared to others. And this, I think, is something we all need to worry about, particularly if we are going to meet our moral responsibility of becoming more localized, empowering more localized, smaller communities, but also facilitating diaspora communities to continue to be part of the essential humanitarian response.
Thanks, Khalil. I think that you've built nicely upon what we've heard already, and I was wondering if maybe we can come back to Hibak and ask the very question that Khalil is raised around the particular risks associated with Muslim faith-based agencies. I know this is something that Islamic Relief Worldwide is working on with a number of smaller and local groups to really build up a sense of a community response to some of the extra burdens that community, those deliverers are faced with. I wonder if that's also been an issue for the NIR Network, Hibak.
I mean, there have been conversations around particular risks associated with faith-based agencies, but primarily, I mean, we continuously, when we talk to our members, the issue of risk or risk transfer continues to come up from an aspect of local and national organizations. And that, having to meet, as I said before, many or several compliance regulations and not just simply the back donor regulations, forces a lot of our organizations with limited staff to have to work extremely hard to meet multiple compliance regulations per project. So for us, it's the issue is more of the lack of overheads and the lack of additional support in building systems, and not only that, but having a coordinated system. In my personal history working with international NGOs, typically our systems existed to meet the hardest of, or the most stringent donor regulations, and there was staff at headquarters who particularly worked on compliance, and local and national organizations just don't have that added value to be able to have particular staff, particular financing towards this particular support. So for us, it's a continued conversation of how do we ensure that that we start talking about risk transfer, strategic partnerships, and we start looking at compliance regulations that aren't just per organization or per partner, but that there's some sort of coordinated effort.
Thanks for that. I'm going to turn to Jeremy now and ask you that question to follow on from what we just heard from Hibek. In your position, you are double-hatted, right? So you are not only the head of the financing group at ICVA, but you're also the coordinator of the Less Paper, More Aid efforts. And I wonder if you have heard from donors and international NGOs if they are working in a way of addressing some of Hibek's questions on risk management or risk transfer. And a focus on building an opportunity more system-wide as opposed to individual partnerships when it comes to overhead and support costs.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jamie. I think a couple of responses to that. I think what we are correctly getting into is one of the fundamental challenges in the risk space, which is around how in the system do we push back or constructively deal with unrealistic conditions that might be placed on NGO partners in particular. And I think we've correctly identified that systematically we don't yet have huge progress, but I think there are some good examples maybe to highlight of where we can start to take some better action there. So we'll hear later on a little bit from a donor perspective at the end of the panel to get some indication of some action taking place there. I think around this question of risk sharing in particular, linked to the idea of risk transfer. So I think there is a need to push forward with some better collective discussion around this issue of risk transfer, risk sharing, and how we, in collaboration with donors, discuss this issue of what levels of risk are realistic to maintain and manage at different points in the chain of humanitarian funding, whether that's donor, whether that's NGO partner, whether that's local partners in the field, etc. So there needs to be more of a collective discussion around that chain and what types of risk are retained and managed at each step in that process, and make that more of a collective discussion. So I think we have hints of that starting. Like I said, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but I think we'll hear more about that later in the panel. I think there's also a good point here about this costing issue, which I think is a very practical issue that's good to come back to. So Hibek raised this quite clearly early on around the question of indirect versus direct costs, how we better set up systems to recognize where there might be costs that should in fact be directly linked to the ability to implement programming well. So I think that's where we do have some action there as well. Starting up certainly Money Where It Counts initiative, which is actually led by NRC as well, looking at how we have a better system for identifying and classifying costs more generally across the system, which can also lead to a more consistent way of handling things like direct versus indirect costing, which again is a technical piece of setting up your accounting and cost classifications, but I think it also has some pretty clear implications on how we manage risk better when it comes to the very practical piece that we've heard of how simply you pay for it, which if we're unable to do that well, then hard to envision a scenario where we really do a good job of embedding things like risk management into the culture of our organizations. So again, initiatives like Money Where It Counts, which I think is a good opportunity to dig into this question of very practically how do we pay for some of these systems around better managing risk, better classifying costs, and paying the real share of what it takes to do those things well in the implementation of our programming in the field.
Thanks, Jimmy. I know we still have 2 polls up, so I wanted to see if you see them on your screen, Jeremy, if you want to make a comment of what you're reading into those 2 poll results so far as we go through the rest of this session.
Yeah, so I think the poll results are quite interesting and quite encouraging, actually. I'd say this corresponds to my understanding of the discussions I've had with NGO partners as well. So I think pretty clearly we can see that in both the polls, so the first one, risk management as a part of the culture of an organization, a pretty healthy number getting into the agree category, low on strongly agree, but also low on the strongly disagree side too. So we seem to be a little middle of the road that's skewed towards agreeing, which I think is a great sign that there seems to be an increase in this acceptance that risk management needs to be embedded into the culture of the organization, as we see there, both in decision making, and I think critically that staff in general are aware of their role in risk management. I think this is something that came out particularly in the Jean-François's comments, that when we're dealing with risk in particular as a constantly changing element that need to be agile, to me that reinforces the need to really have risk management embedded into the culture of an organization, where it's not just an individual with risk in their title responsible for it, or a department, but all of us working within an organization understand what our role is in managing risk well. So to me, that's an encouraging sign. I think probably more to be done, and particularly in the collaborative piece, how we have a discussion across the system as to how this can be done better, important to carry forward. And then second, do you have a person in your organization responsible for advising leadership on risk management? So in addition to the need to embed across the organization in organizational culture, it is key too to have somebody that can drive that process. So interesting, I think, to see that we certainly have a trend towards at least someone having this as part of their job responsibility or full-time. So seems to be a quite high percentage combined, certainly over half, with either a full-time position or somebody with this responsibility in their job. So I think that's very good. Still a good number of organizations without a formal position, but considering it, I think that's good. Good to consider how we can bump that up to have more formal positioning there. And quite encouraging to see a very low number, only 7.5%, suggesting that there's really no formal approach to risk management. So work to be done, but I think quite encouraging numbers overall there.
Thanks, and I encourage people who haven't completed the poll to do so before this session's concluded. I wanted to come back, Jean-François, to something you said, and I think that you asked the most challenging question that all of us are faced with, and that is, what type of agency do we want to be, and where do we want to go? And I think that's irrespective of our size, our location, and our locality, insofar as if we're a local organization, a CBO, or a big INGO. And it really, you put it very clearly, are we going to be an agency, or do we want to be an agency that's focused on controlling and mitigating the risk as they come to us, or are we going to be a people-centered, principled responder? And I wanted to ask you, how do you judge those discussions when we work in conflict areas, as the session starts off with scene setting, and in those conflict areas we could be controlled by the local authorities that say you can assist the population in this few kilometers but not the ones beyond, because that's beyond the government control. How do we judge that when we're talking about risk? How do we have those conversations to expand our positioning?
To be honest, James, I would have preferred that you stop at the first question, because the second one is the most complicated one. and it does. And we are, so maybe one comment on the first point of your question. What I think it is that the main risk for us, if we want to remain a humanitarian organization, I'm talking for Action Against Hunger, but I think that of course it's worth for every size, every type of people-based organization. If we want to remain who we are, if we want to remain thankful and respectful to the principle, we have to consider that the first and the main risk, it is the risk that vulnerable populations are facing. It is the risk that vulnerable people, vulnerable population that we are trying to support or that we are working with are facing. This is, of course, it's nice words, but it has to be what we must keep in mind when we are at the second level dealing with risk management, when we are monitoring the situation, when we are assessing the level of security and safety for our teams, for the teams of our partners, etc., etc. It is the mindset we must have when we are giving feedback or when we are compliant to the donors, even if it's costly, because if we forget this main aspect, if we forget this, I was about to call it ideal, but for me it's not an ideal. It is the reason why we are here. The reason why we are here is to transform risk into responsibility. Normally, you know, the word which goes with risk normally is opportunities. When we make an assessment, there is risk, opportunities, etc. But me, I would like to link the word risk with responsibilities, because at the end of the day, it is the responsibility of who we are as an organization. We have to be compliant to the donors, whoever they are, institutional donors, but also to the individual people who are supporting us with a few euros and few dollars. But we have to be compliant towards them. But at the end of the day, along with individual donors and the states and institutional donors, we have to handle the responsibility of putting principles in action and being able to continuously bring in support to the most vulnerable. If we lose that from the way we look at our daily work, even though our daily work is very administrative, is very based on reporting and monitoring, etc., we have to maintain this idea. This is my general comment and my general also proposition to what we are, who we are now, and who we want to become or to remain. And to be more precise and to try to answer or to share the question I have and we all have, it was also a question that I had when I was working for the Red Cross. I'm mentioning that because I was working for the French Red Cross, and the Red Cross is not a pure NGO, as everybody knows. They are also auxiliary to the states. And so sometimes it's such situation that you described, when there is the army in an area saying, you will be able to deliver your aid up to this line, but across this line, you won't be able to access it, etc. Or maybe it can be also the police who tell you that in developed countries. The question is, who am I serving? Am I serving the principles, and am I defending the principles, and or am I just trying to not to be complice and supporting the authorities, especially when the authorities are not respecting the common law. So of course it is a permanent question, and I am nobody to tell the audience today what is the best behavior. Just share with you the question I ask myself and my organization is, are we in our mandate, and are we respecting the principles? I would like to end up with the last thing, which is absolutely necessary to completely answer the previous question. It is advocacy. Because if I have to accept not to cross the border because the army or the police prevent me not to be there, I have to, at the same time, develop a very strong and long-lasting advocacy capacity to make mindset change and to make states and public authorities not to put humanitarian principle at stakes. And so for me, the two best way to address risk, I mean the risk that we are facing at the moment, is of course to continue doing our risk management, risk assessment, to have the culture of risk, safety, security, everything we already mentioned. But it's at the same time to be to speak with a loud voice and collectively as possible, including the donors, including the states, and of course us, the NGOs and the networks of NGOs, we have to speak with one voice to defend, not to protect, but to defend the respect of principles in order not to see the situation you took as an example being more and more present on the ground. So I think risk management now is necessarily including strong advocacy on principles.
Thanks, Jean-François. I would expect nothing less from ACF, so I'm very glad to hear that. And it's good to have a call for solidarity as well across that. Khalil, before I turn to Hibek, I want to ask you just to follow on from what this call to action that we've heard around advocacy. It's often hard for INGOs and even harder for national and local NGOs to speak up in certain circumstances. And I wonder if we go back to your initial intervention earlier around the particular areas that you face, having Islamic in your name. How does that, or let me rephrase myself, does that allow you more of a sense of ability to advocate, or does it also add another risk for your agency and your team to advocate around these issues?
Yeah, thanks, James. It's really, I think it's the nub of the issue. And, the question that you asked, Jean-François, was, what type of agencies do we want to be? And I think in answering your question to me, I would say, where Jean-François ended his response is critical in that we would ask, well, what type of sector do we want to be? And this is where I don't think it's controversial to say that as such a broad sector, the impact of this, the impact of risk management is being, the impact it's having is very, very different. And we know from our experience that actually, Muslim charities, and I think this is borne out by the research, have faced, the greatest obstacles, for instance, in accessing financial services. Now, why that's a problem, paradoxically, is that the non-Muslim and secular agencies are actually quite reliant increasingly on Muslim charities to deliver assistance, particularly in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria. We found particularly, we've played a really active role in Yemen, for instance. So I think what our concern for the sector is that I don't think anyone would argue with the principle and the premise that, of course, meeting and managing risks is key. It's central to what we do. That includes counterterrorism, that includes money laundering, that includes aid diversion in all its form. All of those things are absolutely what we, kind of have to systematize. We're good at certain things and we're less good at other things. That I think we can accept. I think what's more difficult is there's these layers that are now being placed. So you've got the legal and regulatory framework, the counterterrorism measures. Then you've also got the donor expectations and obligations within their due diligence and requirements. And then you've got the financial institutions overlaying that with their know your client requirements, their due diligence. Now, what we say is that, in the design of some of those processes, those externalities are elements that do compromise the humanitarian principles. And actually, as a sector, what we're seeing is that we're accepting of certain requirements. Let's take, for instance, it's I think quite a topical example, but the requirement to provide beneficiary data. Certain major institutional donors are moving to saying, oh, we need to know who your end beneficiary, the end person is. Lots of issues around that. Certain agencies may be willing to accept that. What it's doing is that it's sort of isolating certain sections of the humanitarian sector as a whole. So what we've found is, we're, whilst a large organization that can manage and that can resource some of these very complex compliance requirements, the fact is we're largely an individual funded, a community-based fundraising organization. So the costs are essentially borne by our individual donors. But similarly, we don't have the cover, or we don't have the relationship sometimes with the institutional donors that then puts us in a much more disadvantageous position with respect to the financial institutions. So again, it's these externalities that are disproportionately impacting certain sections of our community, our sort of humanitarian community, and that collaboration to challenge and to properly scrutinize what's being asked of us, I think is key, because I do think it is compromising the humanitarian principles that we all, kind of want to stand by.
Thanks, Khalil. I think you've raised a lot of really interesting points, and I'm sure we could go on for hours. I feel like we should be a 24-hour radio channel where people can opt in and opt out, because I would love to have that conversation in more detail. Hibek, I mentioned just before going to Khalil that I wanted to give you at least a final word in this part of the session, and I wanted to ask you if particularly when it comes to that risk sharing, I think often we see it as a cycle of downward push, and I don't like using the word downward, but to the local and to the national actor. When Khalil just mentioned about beneficiary data sharing, I wonder if we can shine the spotlight on some of us as the INGO representatives and hear from you. Do we ask you for such information, and are you in a position as a representative of a group of national NGOs to say anything on that point, if we're asking you to share information with us that you think puts people at risk?
Yeah, thanks. I think this could be a 24-hour conversation. I think that Khalil brought up some really important points. I guess let me step back before I answer your question, Jamie, to say I absolutely agree with Jean-Francois around advocacy and collective advocacy. I mean, that's the premise of NIR. But we do need to come together on some of these issues around risk, because it's something that's faced by all implementing agencies. And as far as kind of risk sharing, look, I think that there have been some comments on the side from some of the listeners, and I think they hit the nail on the head by talking about trust. I think this is when it comes to risk sharing starts at the planning phase. It starts with policy. It starts with trust building, and it's really around the donor understandably having to deal with public funding, the international NGO or international community working with the donor, and as Claude pointed out, and Jean-Francois, individual donors, and it's the local organizations not only working with this ecosystem, but also working with the community. And so I think more and more, as we start to shift toward the conversation of risk sharing, we really need to start having a conversation, an open conversation around trust and around the idea of if we really are working towards working and responding towards, affected communities, then we need to do it in a more collaborative, concise way. And when we talk about risk sharing around finance and security, I mean, it risks the risk is shared by all. You're right, it does trickle down. It trickles down to local organizations who don't get some of the support. And I want to hammer this home to say, it really is around financing. It really is being given the ability to be able to build your systems, to be able to establish these mitigation plans, and to be able to implement. As far as beneficiary lists, to be honest, that's not something that we've had a conversation as NIR, and it's not something that has been brought up by our members. But there's a danger in that. There's of course a danger of privacy of information. There's a danger of requesting an already fragile relationship between an international partner and a local and national NGO to ask for information where some local organizations don't have that ability or that power to stand up to their international partner. And so some of the pressure that we continuously hear the international community speaking about from the donors is similarly, if not more, the pressure that the local and national organizations feel when wanting to really support their community and respond to disasters and unfortunate conflicts in their country. So to me, it comes back to also this idea around zero tolerance and how it's possible to have an honest conversation when the assumption from the very beginning is there is no tolerance towards any of the organizations either making a mistake or learning from their mistakes. This is a sector where we should learn and we should evolve and we should improve. And that premise of zero tolerance from the very beginning is something that is a bit antithetical to our sector. I think that's where I'll stop, and I see that there are some questions on the side, so if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Sebak. That's very good, and I think you're right. We have lots of questions, and just like you, I saw the word trust popping up very much within the chat on the screen in front of me, and I think that everyone is absolutely right. When we talk about risk, when we talk about looking at responsibility, as Jean-Francois has indicated, as opposed to risk and opportunities, I think it all comes down to trust. If we're really going to reach any level of a better understanding and an improved system of solidarity, it is around trust within partnerships. After all, that is what partnerships are all about. I'm going to move on a little bit and just to welcome Bjorn Hoffman online. So Bjorn is the Humanitarian Advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, and also has been working incredibly closely for the last few years on the Grand Bargain. So Bjorn, I know that you have a few comments that you want to raise after listening to this session. Over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you very much, colleagues. I've been following this session, really interesting discussions and conversations, and really delighted to be a part of this. I was asked indeed to share a very brief update on the risk and how it relates to the grand bargain. A number of issues were already raised this morning. Yves mentioned that the issue of risk sharing needs to be put on the table. Jeremy, you mentioned that a collective discussion is needed, and a few, including Philippe this morning, has referred to the grand bargain already a few times. Indeed, in one of the grand bargain meetings in September in 2018, the topic of risk sharing came on the table, and it was discussed. And essentially, during this meeting, the ICRC in the Netherlands had agreed to have a look at how we could take this conversation forward, not just within the context of the grand bargain, but more broadly. Clearly, since then, we've been looking at how this could be done. We've already heard in today's session that there are indeed many faces of risk out there: operational risk, fiduciary risk, counterterrorism risks, many different ones. So the question is, where are these risks being discussed, and is there an added value for the grand bargain? Now, we've reflected since then how we could frame the discussion within the context of the grand bargain, and also how risk and risk sharing has already been discussed potentially in some of the work streams within the grand bargain. You know, there are originally 10 work streams that are looking at different topics such as transparency, localization, cash transfer programming, flexible funding, harmonized reporting, and the nexus. So we started to see how has risk already been discussed in the last 4 years within these work streams. And we're now at a point after the Netherlands and ICRC had agreed to have a look at how to take this conversation forward, that we would like to be more specific in seeing what and how could risk sharing being discussed and taken forward in the context of the grand bargain to be complementary to all the other fora where risk and risk sharing, trust and accountability is being discussed, because clearly there are fora where this is taking place. So we want to complement, not duplicate, but we also feel that we need to be very specific in how we approach this conversation. And I think today's workshop is really contributing to that. I'm sure my colleague from ICRC is also listening, and we'll see how we can reflect some of the discussions, questions, and concerns raised in today's workshop forward within our conversation. And our objective is to indeed have this on the agenda of the annual meetings that take place every year in the summer, and to see how we can take this conversation forward within the context of the grand bargain and how we can contribute to that. So far, a quick update from me. James, over to you.
Thanks, Bjorn. That's very good to have, and I'm glad that you were able to join us and that you were there for this morning's session as well, which is also great to hear. I'm looking across the room to Arnhild. I'm going to ask her to give us a couple of questions that have come up on the chat, and then I will come back to the speakers to address some of those questions. Over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jamie. Yes, we've had a lot of questions coming in. Thank you for that. We have a few now to bring in. Hopefully we'll have time for a second round as well. So to start off, we have 2 questions from Ole in Germany. These might be interesting for Jean-François or others who have comments on them. So first question, do organizations give up on the principles for practices that promise less risk? So the example that he brings is, for example, biometric registration, by all means, like we observe happening currently in Yemen. Are organizations giving up on principles in favor of taking on practices that promise less risk, such as biometric registration? A second question from Ole, why don't we see risks in the reception of funds from donors who are somehow involved in the host country, for instance, politically or as a war actor? So those are a couple of questions from Ole. Next, we have a question from Howard in the UK. This might be an interesting question for Khalil. What do the panelists think it will take to convince donors to allow for and resource a risk-sharing approach? Is it a matter of business case efficiency arguments, or is it by centering on contexts where the response is largely depending on local actors? Because the ethical arguments don't seem to get acted on alone. Another question, this is from Charles in Switzerland. As ICVA's paper mentioned, quote, zero tolerance in the humanitarian sector should mean, quote, zero tolerance to a lack of policies, guidelines, tools, or systems to effectively manage risk. Yet, some governments or their treasuries may still interpret zero tolerance as zero incidents, which is often unrealistic and conflict-affected in contexts. How do we find common ground with governments when it comes to acceptable risk management mechanisms, including resources to help embed an ERM culture in humanitarian organizations? That was related to some points from Jeremy. Then there was a follow-up question to Charles's previous one, perhaps drawing on Khalil's comments. Charles writes, Khalil's example about KYC and beneficiary vetting is another example. Are we articulating to donors how such requirements are incompatible with humanitarian principles and what the impact for people we're serving will or could be? I have one more. Sorry, it's a heavy round. This is a question for Hibak, and it's coming from Summer in Palestine. Summer writes, as national NGOs, how do we transfer the risks? Will donors and INGOs accept this responsibility? So seeing that as national NGOs, we have these risks, how essentially can we transfer them back to our partners? Over to you.
Well, I can say I'm very glad I'm moderating and not trying to answer any of those questions. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. So I wonder if we go back to the first question. Let's go to Jean-Francois first, and just to remind, it's looking at have we already, in essence, put risk first when we do face when we implement biometric programming, and maybe you want to say a little bit more or something different, Jean-Francois, to address that question.
Yeah. Thank you, James. May I just give an example related to the question from Summer in Palestine beforehand, because the question is, as NGOs, international NGOs, how do you retransfer the risk? And so it's just a little story that it's not a nice story, by the way. It was in Nigeria. It was in November. After, maybe some of you know that Action Against Hunger, along with Mercy Corps, have been shut down during 6 weeks in Borno State for reasons I won't comment here, of course. And then so we start again working. But what we discovered during the just after the shutdown, because we of course managed the risk, and so we started not to put people anymore on the roads due to the very severe deterioration of the security in the Borno. And so in terms of risk transfer, we discovered that as we stopped sending teams to Little Village or to Garnison Town, we saw during 1 week around 4,000 people coming from Garnison Town on the road to Maiduguri in order to receive the distribution we were supposed to go to and do at their place. So in terms of risk transfer, it is huge, and it was very, very critical for us to discover that as we were dealing with risk for our staff and for our partners, without willing to do so, we were indirectly kind of transferring the risk to the vulnerable people. because there is no reason there is risk for us to be on a road between Maiduguri and another one garrison town, and there would be no risk for a community to be himself on a road. So it's just a little story that we have to deal with, and I think we are not the only one in this kind of situation. And to come back to the question of Ole, this is a good example. This is a good example, and we have to be robust on the principles, because if we are not robust on the principles, we might drift and start questionable practices. And a comment on that: to be robust on the principle is not to look at principles as a book put on the table which makes a nice picture. It has to be something which is really lively. But concretely, I do not think that doing biometric registration, especially when it's about cash distribution or some activities like that, could be against the humanitarian principles. What I think, at the contrary, it is what are we going to do with those data? What are we going to do with those personal information coming from the people who are working with and we are supporting? This is the use of the data. If we would misuse the data, this would represent a breach on the principles and on the rules. And of course, for Action Against Hunger, we are not doing that. We are not sharing the data, even though in some areas, in some contexts, we are of course using this kind of digital registration process. And in terms of screening, where is the money coming from in terms of states, institutional donors, or private companies? Of course, as an organization, not only SF France, but the whole network, we have, I hope, strong enough, I would say, well-adapted ethical principle and due diligence-like measures that allow us not to take, and to be precise, to refuse to take money from states, agencies, or private companies that would have negative activities on the countries where we are working. So to be precise, we are following those rules, and we are refraining from taking money from some countries or from some agency in countries like Yemen or in countries like Iraq or in other countries because of the activities of the organization involved in the war, in the context of war where we are working.
Thanks, Jean-François. I know that we have about 15 minutes left in the session, so I'm going to turn to Khalil and ask you if you wanted to address Howard's question, which was, what do we think about, or how do we think that we can convince donors to allow better resource distribution and a sharing of risk approach?
Yeah, happy to try and pick that up. Thank you, Howard. I think there's a couple of things to be positive about, and that is there's some examples of good, open, and this kind of honest dialogue that includes the key stakeholders. So there's, within the UK, we've convened, or the government have convened, what's called a tri-sector group, and that includes NGO representatives from the financial sector, and representatives from across the various ministries within government. And what has become really evident as part of that process, which is now being looked at in a number of other states as well as the jurisdictions, and certainly internationally, is that we mustn't take it for granted that even institutional donors fully understand the implications or consequences of some of their requests and demands as part of their due diligence. there's been a real sort of process of learning and education in terms of just what is involved at, sort of the ground level in some of these really complex situations. So I think in terms of what will it take, I think what I think it will take, and what I would sort of encourage the sector, I suppose, and organize, membership organizations or representative organizations to continue to advocate for this collective dialogue. So where, the concerns and some of these challenges can be properly addressed and discussed. I think one other thing I do want to sort of underline is that what's really critical is that the different voices are also represented in that dialogue. I think I've seen it too often that, certain, without being pejorative, but the usual suspects, larger organizations, more established organizations will certainly have a seat at the table. But what we're generally finding is that actually, the most smaller and, actually, ironically, the most affected organizations aren't necessarily having their position and their experience properly represented. I'll just, and I suppose that relates to Charles's question as well about the KYC and beneficiary data, and are we articulating this to donors? And I think again, it just, I don't mean to be disparaging, but I think sometimes some of these compliance requirements are designed and put together away from people, in these institutions, in these departments, away from people that fully understand the implications of what that means, whether it's from an IHL perspective or from just, a compromise of the principles, so this idea that you can simply share beneficiary data, and that's something that we need to make freely available. Somebody who's devising a compliance, system or compliance checklist can identify that, but actually what the implications. So, I think I think that the nub of Charles's question, are we articulating it to donors? I certainly think we can articulate it better, and I certainly think, the implications of some of those things definitely need to be part of the dialogue.
Thanks, Cleo. I'm glad that you came back to Charles's question, because I think that is also very pertinent, and it fit very nicely into your response. Hibek, I wonder if you want to say a couple words, not just on Samar's question that was directly related or directly asked towards national NGOs, but more broadly on anything else that you've heard so far. Just to note, we may be running out of time, so we may not make it to a second round of questions, but don't forget, you can always ask questions, and my colleagues at PHAP will definitely get them out to the right people and hopefully get you an answer. Okay, so over to Hibek. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. Looking at Samir's question, and in general, this conversation on the side around trust and kind of risk transfer, I think really we need to be talking about risk sharing and transferring back to international NGOs or the international community. I don't think is necessarily the answer. And I think Khalil hit the nail on the head from a systemic perspective. I think it's around having a seat at the table. I think, there are conversations around having national NGOs sitting on HCTs, having them sit on global clusters and national cluster systems. There are policy conversations that are more inclusive of national and local organizations. It's really about making sure that there's a seat at the table for the different organizations and the different archetypes of organizations to make these decisions. In order for it to emulate in our policies, the conversation needs to happen at all levels. It needs to happen at the local level, it needs to happen at the regional level, and it needs to happen at the global level. And so the more we start having these open conversations, such as today, I think that you'll start to see systemic change. And there needs to be openness. There needs to be openness from the local and national organizations, the international NGOs, the UN, the donors, to be able to have this conversation and to start shifting some of the policies from the donors all the way down. From an individual organization perspective, we continue to talk to our members about really having these conversations at the level of when you start having strategic conversations with your partners. And when you're talking about proposals and design of projects, and you're talking about responding or resilient projects or resiliency projects, it's really about ensuring that these risk sharing conversations are happening at the implementation level, where you are beginning to have conversations about risk not only for the INGO but also for the donor and also for the community. I mean, these are more and more conversations that just need to happen throughout these different scenarios. And I think if they do and they happen in an open and honest way, I think you'll start to slowly see changes. Changes exist. There are organizations that are better at this. There are some that are, I think, struggling, and there are some that are definitely a majority that are open to changing. And so it's from a strategic and a programmatic level, but also systemically, we need to start having these conversations more and more.
Hibek, once again, you've also hit the nail on the head, I think, by focusing on this question of risk, and we are all faced with risk, no matter what constituency we're representing. And I think that we have to take seriously that, yes, different risk levels may differ across the constituencies, but we can't neglect and forget that everyone is faced with different levels of it, and that it's only through this trust, as it keeps on coming up again on the left-hand side of my screen, at least under the chat, to focus on something that we need to build up better. I'm going to turn to Jeremy and give you a warning. I'm only going to allow you 2 minutes maximum. But just to wrap up from your side and address maybe those two questions that were focused on you. I know you only have 2 minutes. I'm sorry, Jeremy.
That's okay, Jamie. I'll take it on. So my 2-minute recipe for the zero tolerance question, and fortunately, I think we've already heard in the responses a big part of the answer. So this issue around zero tolerance, how we transform that to more of a zero tolerance for inaction as opposed to a zero tolerance for incidents, I think it's closely related to this issue of risk sharing. I think effectively this is the same issue, right? How we improve risk sharing and avoid this zero tolerance language around incidents. So I think there's three key things. We've already heard a lot about it. One, embedding thinking around risk management into our organizational culture. Both Howard was asking a question around this, Smriti and others were discussing it in the chat. This question of risk at the center rather than trust or responsibility. So I actually think part of embedding risk management and getting at this question, so in the absence of good risk management, what happens is we have risk at the center instead of trust and responsibility. I think part of embedding risk management into organizational culture actually helps to improve trust and responsibility, which is a key component of having a practical discussion around better risk sharing and shifting our thinking about zero tolerance. To this issue of funding, we heard this in Ole's question and Jean-Francois's response a little bit too. I think critical that we consider risk management practice at the point that we accept funding. So part of the decision process for taking on funding, this is considering the principles, considering our organizational identity, is good risk management as part of that process. More often what happens is we say yes to funds and then we try and think later about how we manage the risk associated with that. So I think upfront consideration of risk management at the point where accepting funds critical to this question of how we address zero tolerance thinking and improve risk sharing. And then I think third, we've heard a lot about it already, collective action is really key. So part of the point in this discussion, part of the point in picking up some of discussion that we heard Bjorn mention, led by ICRC and Netherlands on improved risk sharing. Khalil and Habak both mentioned it as well. So we need to have better collective discussion, engage both NGOs and donors in how we improve these conditions for risk sharing, zero tolerance language, and ensure that we have really mutual understanding of the implications of language and policies like that. So how we really come to a better mutual understanding of the implications in the field if we don't do an appropriate job of establishing how we share risk better between the different actors in the humanitarian space. Okay, probably took more than 2 minutes. I'll leave it there.
It's okay that you've just taken away from my wrap-up, so I'm in your debt. I want to say thanks again to all four of our speakers, Jeremy, Hebek, Jean-Francois, and Khalil. You've raised a lot of questions, and it's interesting. I have the privilege of working for an organization now, the Norwegian Refugee Council, where we've been focusing on risk for more than 10 years now, and my team will hang me to dry if I don't mention that we're about to bring out a teaser to our risk management toolkit, which will have a new name. But the teaser is now on the ICVA website. It's called Practical Guide for Project Cycle Management and Counterterrorism Risks. And as if you look at the left-hand side on the chat, our friend Reza Chowdhury in Bangladesh has also been focusing on all the other components of risk and risk management that we have to pay attention to. And I think he's probably right. In his environment, our focus on counterterrorism may not be the right one for that. But what we're looking at NRC is other forms of the impact that this has had. And we've heard from it, and all four speakers have talked about it, and I thank them for that. The conversation can go on forever, I'm sure, and we have one more session this afternoon, session 3, which will bring us to a crescendo for the ICVA virtual conference. I think I won't try to summarize everything that's here. We know that PHAP are excellent at sharing these webinars and the outcome discussions, but also I encourage all the 200 plus participants to continue the dialogue, not only within our own organizations, but as Hebek and others have said, this has to be a move of system-wide approach, and it's great that we can build our own capacities or work with our partners in different ways, but it's also important that we share, and as Jean-Francois said, advocate, advocate, advocate. We need to make sure that all parts of the system are working collectively under this very important word of trust inside partnerships and mutual trust. So on that note, I think I'm going to hand us back over to our colleagues at PHAP, and they will wrap us up. So thanks again to everyone that participated. Special thanks to our 4 participants.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. I'd like to echo that. Tremendous thanks to everyone involved, particularly all of you participants. The questions and also particularly the chat was incredibly rich. So thanks so much for that. Brings me to an important point. The recording, which will also include, you can play back the whole thing, including the chat and the slides, and of course the audio. That recording will be available on the event page, and it will have subtitles in English as well as in French and Arabic, so you'll get a notification when that's available. As Jamie mentioned, the final session of the ICVA virtual annual conference will take place at the end of the day today. That will be starting in 1.5 hours. Feel free to stay on in the virtual room and continue the chat in the left if you like. Hope to see all of you joining again for the next session. Again, that's starting in 1.5 hours from now, and you'll also receive a little reminder by email with the link to rejoin. See you soon. Bye-bye.